Should it be recording or should it not?
It should be.
Okay, so I'm gonna be presenting work in progress research on the labor of mourning as it
Recording in progress.
ties to the labor of reconstruction amidst the destruction of graves, and particularly in South Lebanon. Okay, so the owls previously only dwelt in developed structures, but when Imam Hussein was martyred, they refused to stay in developed structures and refused to take anything but ruins as abodes. Indeed, the owls fast during the day and are aggrieved until nightfall. At night, they lament on Imam al-Hussein till the morning. The hadith narrates a post-catastrophic moment in which a singular event, the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein, produces a protracted space of mourning. In its aftermath, the owl emerges as a permanent figure of grief, migrating across spatial and temporal registers, from built environments to ruins, and from the order of the day to a nocturnal temporality. Its lamentation constitutes a labor of mourning that commences only through this reconfiguration of dwelling, shifting from the realm of the living to that of the dead. In this allegory, two political subjects emerge, that of the migrating corpse and the aggrieved mourner. Both subjects undergo a spatio-temporal migration. The corpse travels from the site of ascension, the place of martyrdom or death, to the site of recession, which is the cemetery or shrine, while the mourner shifts from the built environment, the dwelling of the living, to the ruin, the dwelling of the dead. In the psychoanalytic tradition, mourning is primarily understood as a question of temporality, a process of contemplation and confrontation with death. The durée of mourning, beginning with burial and funerary processions, unfolds within the space of the cemetery and is inextricably linked to its architectural and urban order. When that order is disrupted, whether through the destruction, bulldozing, or desecration of graves, it produces a schism, a rupture that awakens the dead and collapses the realm of living and dead onto each other. The destruction of gravestones thwarts the work of mourning, perpetually suspending it until burial grounds are reconstructed and reinscribed, thereby compelling a return to mourning and binding it to the political economy of reconstruction. It is within this rupture that I argue that, in the wake of catastrophe, the return to the labor of mourning through the reconstruction of graves reconfigures the spatiality and architectures of cemeteries, necessitating a new spatial and political relation between the living and the dead. And so here I'm going to be talking about this through the case study of the Khiem Cemetery. Khiem is a border village in South Lebanon, which is currently witnessing a lot of fierce battles between the resistance and Israeli occupation forces. And so I'm using this cemetery in particular because after the period of after the 2024 war and the period of the ceasefire agreement, Khiem was one of the few border villages where people could return to. And so the process of reconstruction was initiated in one way or another. And so the treatment of the rubble of the cemetery in this particular village was thought of and commenced. So we'll see how that unfolds later. The ruination of burial grounds across Palestine and Lebanon is neither arbitrary violence nor a byproduct of Israel's annihilatory intent. It is a calculated and systemic tactic aimed at obliterating all forms of life and death, as well as an erasure of the necessary work of mourning that is known to provide an essential catharsis and an affect known to sustain the resistance. In Gaza, of 62 cemeteries, only 4 have evaded destruction by Israeli airstrikes and bulldozing. 93.5% have been either completely or partially destroyed. More recently, Israeli forces excavated graves at Al-Batsh Cemetery in the Tufah neighborhood east of Gaza City, while searching for the remains of an Israeli soldier. Forcibly exhuming bodies and bulldozing graves, the landscape of the cemetery was completely altered. Such practices are not new. In 2021, in occupied East Jerusalem, a woman was photographed cradling her son's grave at Al Yusufiya Cemetery, which Israelis were destroying to make way for a theme park. The woman, the mourner, places her body between her son's corpse and the Israeli bulldozer. Just last week, in Shmistar, in the Baalbek region of Lebanon, this intrusion escalated into a more overt display of violence. An Israeli airstrike struck a funeral procession, killing 10 people gathered to bury and mourn a martyr. This was one of the 100 airstrikes carried out across Lebanon that day, which killed over 300 people and injured thousands. Death is reproduced within the setting of the funeral and the site of the cemetery for both the corpse and the mourners. In South Lebanon, the pervasive production of ruin through Israeli rigging and demolition has reduced entire villages along the border strip to rubble. In her essay, Welcome to the Rubble-Based Order, Shivanshi Mariam Raj argues that ruination produces a condition in which rubble itself becomes an ordering logic, one that sustains territorial control through perpetual destruction. I quote, "The rubble-based order carries no clear horizon or measure of victory. Its sole purpose is to inflict as much harm as possible with protracted attacks, varying in intensity and frequency. It seeks to weaken the attacked population and render it debilitated with diminished capacities of rebuilding and rehabilitation, creating a network of dependence." End quote. Israel's targeting of reconstruction equipment, bulldozers, and stone factories reinforces the rubble-based order, with the aim of being punitive to anyone who returns to the land which they scorched. So to go back to Khiem, in Khiem, the border village in South Lebanon, which witnessed and continues to witness today fierce resistance thwarting any Israeli attempt at capturing it. The 2024 war left extensive destruction to the village, its infrastructure and ecology, following the Israeli scorched earth policy. The local cemetery was not spared. Of approximately 3,000 graves, over 1,200 were destroyed. And probably now even more. We just received satellite footage of Khiem before yesterday, and it's completely demolished. Upon returning after the ceasefire agreement, so that's in 2025, the first act of returnees to villages, as always, was to visit the dead. On the first day back, I went to my father's and grandparents' graves, only to find the cemetery reduced to ruins. Heaps of rubble consumed the site of the cemetery. Bouquets of artificial flowers, usually left over loved ones' graves to mark a continuity of mourning when access to the land is no longer possible, were scattered across the stretch of land demarcating the cemetery, akin to a mother's scattering of flower petals on the corpse of her martyred son. The site was completely reconfigured into a mass grave of rubble that now demanded a return to the labor of mourning. And so in particular in the cemetery, the treatment of rubble was very different to how the treatment of rubble usually is in the other parts of Khiem, so where the municipality carried out heavy bulldozing activities to remove the rubble and flatten the earth to kind of make way for other structures to be erected and for the reconstruction process to start. However, in the cemetery itself, the rubble was not discarded, and this is due to two things. First is that there's a certain sanctity to the rubble of a grave, and they prefer that each family decides what to do with the rubble of their loved one's grave. And then the other more religious aspect of it is that there's Quranic inscriptions on this grave, and so to discard of such a thing, it needs to happen in a proper way. And so the municipality decided to kind of clean out the cemetery, but to gather the rubble of each destroyed grave and to place it on top of on top of the grave that it belongs to. And so this practice emerged out of this kind of rupture in the cemetery of burying of the rubble. And so instead of discarding it, the treatment of the rubble was gathered instead, and started a new kind of phenomenon of burying of this rubble. And particularly in the space, so this is just like a quick cross-section of the burial ground. And so usually in the ground that you see here on the right, this is where the corpse is laid to rest. And then the gravestone or the tombstone, the actual marble stone, is raised, it's elevated, raised above the ground, and slanted a bit for functional reasons. And then that space in between, this like empty container or vessel, is usually empty. And so this practice started of placing the rubble inside this container. And so when each family would reconstruct the gravestone, they would conceal this rubble, and it would be placed atop of this. So the act of burial of rubble as a preservation measure is a reclamation of agency on the ruination that seeks to scorch lands and leave it incapacitated. Burial, in this manner of concealment, is also a refusal to commemorate the site of the cemetery as none other than a site of resistance of the dead. It betrays representation for the sake of the sacred. And in that act, the rubble becomes the corpse, treated with the same sanctity. The rubble's funerary procession is marked by the collection of the stone, the careful gathering atop each grave, and ending with its burial and concealment. And so this is what was being done to the graves that already existed. But following the 2024 war, there was a need for more burial grounds to bury the martyrs of that war. And so here we witnessed an expansion of the cemetery. And with that expansion came a rethinking of the design of the graves. So the proliferation of the martyrs' burial grounds following the 2024 war necessitated an inspection in the spatiality of the cemetery and the designs of burial grounds. Here we see the shift as a direct result of the rupture that befell the cemetery. And so here, just like a quick analysis of the design of the graves, we notice this like very sharp diagonal cut in the grave, and this is the first time that we see this. And that space that we were talking about, the container, is left exposed. So instead of concealing that space, it's left exposed, and it's now being used as a space that hosts some artifact of each martyr's, whether throughout his life or artifacts that he held in battle. While seemingly incongruent at first glance, the urban expansion of the cemetery does not echo the destruction that once befallen it, but is born out of it instead, and stands in anticipation of the ruin to come. By designing a burial ground that is already broken or already opened up and marked by a prior rupture, these new graves sit on a threshold and foreshadows a post-catastrophic space where the site of the cemetery transforms formally into a museum in an act of commemoration of the dead. And so the site of the cemetery, particularly this expansion, becomes a stop, becomes a destination for people to come and to kind of understand or historicize the battles that occurred through the narratives of the martyrs. In other villages, this is also happening, and so we see this schism or this rupture changing the architecture of cemeteries. And so this is another village in South Lebanon called Aitarun. The representation of the graves is very different than the one in Khiem, but it also kind of marks this museological element to it. and this representation of a certain battle. And so here the space of the container that we were talking about is completely collapsed and opened up. And the tombstone or the headstone is shaped in a drop of blood. So really like a literal representation of martyrdom. This spatial relation between the living and the dead is rendered clearer through the will of one of the martyrs, 17-year-old Mahdi Ahmed Khrez, in which he left clear instructions for his family on how he wished to be buried. He writes, "No funeral is to be held for me, nor am I to be buried unless it is in my city of Khiem. Even if I were to spend hundreds of years in the morgue, no stone is to be erected on my tomb, nor is my tomb to be before that of my Imam Hassan's." Essentially, what Mahdi is claiming, an inhabitation of or dwelling within the catastrophe, so the catastrophe of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, through a protracted state of mourning that materializes in this instance as the opening of the grave. And it is in this dwelling that the work of liberation could be imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Aya.